Good day, and welcome to In-House Warrior, the daily podcast of the Corporate Counsel Business Journal. With this and a series of shows this week and next, we're doing a number of programs on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we've been fortunate enough to get a number of experts from around the world to weigh in on their points of view of the great disruption and tragedy that's occurring. With us today, Dr. James Dorsey, who's an award-winning journalist and scholar, a senior fellow at the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute, and adjunct senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and the author of the syndicated column and blog, The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer. James, so great to see you again. Welcome back, and I know it's evening there. Good evening to you.
Richard, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Indeed it is. It's 1 a.m.
So, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your joining us so late. Why don't you give a little of your background? I know you've been on the show at least once, I think twice, actually. So just a little background just to bring listeners up to speed.
Well, professionally, I'm a journalist much more than I'm a scholar. I was a foreign correspondent for roughly 40 years for publications like the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. And the focus of my career has been ethnic and religious conflict. A lot of that, of course, in the Middle East, but also in Latin America, in Africa, in Europe, and in Asia. And so clearly what's happening now in the Ukraine is something that is of great interest to me. I've covered wars, basically all the wars in Europe, with other words, the wars in Chechnya, the wars in Georgia, and the wars in former Yugoslavia. And so looking at Ukraine is a logical consequence of all of that.
You have a piece that's coming out this week, which we're going to link to this show, and you were kind enough to let me see an advanced copy of it, Ukraine, Lessons Not Being Learned. Let's talk about that. I know you just touched on it from some of your experience with these past engagements and wars. If you could take us through that.
Well, I'm essentially making 3 points in the article. The first one is that international diplomacy tends to kick the can down the road. With other words, rather than responding to flagrant violations of international law as they occur, and doing so in a form that is firm and unmistakable and has impact, it's done when the crisis really has gotten out of control. So if you take Russia and you go back 14 years, that was when they recognized 2 breakaway republics in Georgia. 6 years later, and there was no response to Georgia. It was the Far From My Bed show, and essentially the Russians got away with it. Then 6 years later, you had Crimea and the fostering of the insurgencies in the Ukraine republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. Sanctions were imposed, but essentially they didn't really fundamentally hurt Russia, or persuade Russia that maybe it should pursue a different course. And so what we're seeing today, in my mind, with the invasion of Ukraine, is the logical conclusion of not having done 14 years ago what we're doing now, and therefore this may have been avoidable. That's the first point. The second point is that the willingness to look the other way with regard to human rights. And the issue with the human rights is, of course, in and of itself, the issue of human rights. But if you get away with that, you can get away with a lot of different other things. And so if you look at whatever crisis you want to look at, whether that's the crisis in Myanmar with the ethnic cleansing of Rohingya, which then ended in a brutal military, didn't end, but brought forth a brutal military takeover, or the 2013 toppling of Egypt's first and only democratically elected president, and what Egypt is today in terms of human rights, failure to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All of those issues are issues like Ukraine that involve human rights, but where leaders who get away with those human rights violations are emboldened. And as a result, what you see is a progression of violation of international law that may or may not involve human rights. And the third point I'm making is, justifiably, Ukraine's neighbors have opened up the doors for refugees from the Ukraine. And they're being welcomed very warmly. They're being given clothing. They're being given cots to lie on. They're being given hot meals. People are opening up their houses. But on that same border, you have whatever number of non-Europeans, African, Arab students, who describe a situation in which there's a bus for Ukrainians to take them across the border every 15 minutes. There's a bus for non-Europeans every 4 hours, and some of those non-Europeans have been standing on that border trying to flee the war in Ukraine for the last 4 days. All of this sort of came together, for me at least, in a video that was posted by Lise Doucet, who's a very prominent BBC correspondent, and she's currently in the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. And she was sending a message to a gathering in Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, to apologize for the fact that she could not be there for the acceptance of an award. Now, and she was pointing out that nobody knew what war meant and what repression of freedom of expression meant better than Iraqis, and particularly Kurds, who've been fighting for their rights for more than a century. And the irony of this whole situation is that 4 months ago, on the Belarus-Polish border, you had a migration crisis too. And at the time, you had large numbers of people from the Middle East, particularly Kurds, trying to cross that border. And in contrast to the way Ukrainians are being received, they were brutally beaten back. And so the issue here is that Europeans, and maybe that's starting to sink in, that Europeans need to start realizing, not the shock, oh, gee, how could this have happened? This is Europe. This is the 21st century. But that wars in Europe are as possible as they are in other parts of the world.